He gave his son everything, his savings, his home, his last chance at a peaceful life. Then one night, in the pouring rain, his own son threw him out like he meant nothing. No warning, no mercy, just a slammed door and silence. But here's the twist: Richard wasn't as powerless as they thought. 30 days later, everything they owned was gone. And this time, he didn't knock. He took it back. So tell me, would you forgive or make them regret everything? Rain hit the pavement in sharp, restless bursts, soaking through Richard Coleman's coat as he stood frozen on the front steps, a worn suitcase hanging loosely from his hand. The porch light flickered above him, casting unsteady shadows across a face that didn't yet understand what had just happened. Behind him, the door was still open. For a brief second, it felt like there was still time to fix this, still time for his son to take it back. "Derek, we can talk about this," Richard said quietly, his voice barely rising above the storm. But Derek didn't step closer. He didn't soften. If anything, his expression hardened, like he had already made this decision long before tonight. "There's nothing to talk about," he replied, flat, almost impatient. "You can't stay here anymore." The words didn't land all at once. They sank in slowly, piece by piece, like cold water seeping through cracks. Richard blinked, searching his son's face for hesitation, for something human, but found none. Inside, Vanessa stood with her arms crossed, watching without a word. Not even Liam came to the door. A sudden movement broke the moment. Derek reached down, grabbed the rest of the old man's belongings, and dropped them beside the suitcase. The sound was dull, final. "You'll be fine," Derek added, already turning away. And then it happened. The door shut. Not violently, not dramatically. Just a slow, deliberate push, wood meeting frame with a quiet, irreversible click. The porch light flickered again and went still. Richard didn't move. Rain ran down his face, but he didn't wipe it away. He just stood there, staring at the door that no longer opened for him, his grip tightening slightly on the suitcase handle. Somewhere deep inside, a single question surfaced, sharper than the cold. How does a father become a stranger in his own child's home? A car passed. The world kept moving. Behind that door, his family went back to their lives. Out here, he had none. But even then, as the silence settled and the weight of it pressed in, something about the moment felt incomplete, like a story that hadn't reached its true breaking point yet. Because this wasn't the worst thing that was going to happen. He didn't always stand alone in the rain like this. There was a time when Richard Coleman was the one people leaned on, the man who fixed things, who carried weight without complaint, who made sure everyone else had more than enough even when he quietly went without. For over 4 decades, he worked as a construction engineer, waking before sunrise, coming home long after dark, his hands rough, his back worn, but his purpose clear. Every hour he gave away had a destination: his family. There was someone who used to wait for him at the door. Margaret, his wife. She had a way of softening the edges of his hardest days, a quiet smile that made everything feel manageable again. But 10 years ago, that door stopped opening for her. Illness came fast, and it didn't leave room for goodbyes the way they had imagined. One hospital room, one final squeeze of the hand, and just like that, Richard was left to finish the rest of the story alone. Derek was still young then. Not a child, but not ready to carry the weight of loss either. So Richard did what he had always done. He stepped forward and absorbed it all. The grief, the responsibility, the silence at the dinner table. He didn't talk about how empty the house felt. Instead, he focused on what came next: college tuition, rent, bills, opportunities. "I'll handle it," he would say whenever Derek hesitated, whenever the numbers didn't add up. And he did. Years passed like that, quiet sacrifices stacking on top of each other, unseen but never insignificant. When Derek wanted to start a business, Richard dipped into his retirement savings without hesitation. When that didn't work out, he didn't complain. He just kept working, adjusting, covering the gaps. Then came the house. A larger place in a better neighborhood. Enough space for Derek, for Vanessa, for a future that looked stable on the surface. The kind of home Richard had never allowed himself to dream about when he was younger. It required a decision, one that most people would have paused over. He sold his own house. The place filled with memories of Margaret. The walls that had held their life together. Gone, converted into numbers in a bank account, then transferred almost entirely into the purchase of Derek's new home. "Put it in your name," Richard had said at the time, waving off the concern. "It's easier that way. You're building your life now." Derek didn't argue much. Maybe he believed it made sense. Maybe he didn't think far enough ahead to question it. At the closing table, Richard signed where he needed to sign, then stepped back as Derek's name settled onto the deed. A small moment, almost administrative. But something shifted there, quiet, nearly invisible. The money was Richard's. The house was not. At the time, it didn't matter to him. Ownership wasn't the point. Family was. And now, standing outside in the rain, with nothing but a suitcase and a door that wouldn't open, that same moment replayed itself in his mind, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a precision that cut deeper each time it surfaced. He had given everything. So where, exactly, had he gone wrong? For a long time, nothing about that house felt broken. If you walked in on an ordinary evening, you would have seen something close to a perfect family, warm lights, the smell of dinner, quiet conversations overlapping in a way that felt lived in, familiar. Richard usually sat at the same spot at the table, not at the head, but slightly off to the side, as if he had already learned to take up less space without being asked. "Grandpa, look at this," Liam would say, holding up a drawing or a small toy, his eyes bright with that kind of excitement only children carry so easily. Richard would lean in, his expression softening instantly. "That's impressive," he'd reply, sometimes adding, "You might be better than I ever was." It was a simple exchange, but it carried something deeper: connection, continuity, a quiet reminder that not everything he had built was gone. Dinner conversations moved in gentle waves. Derek talked about work, sometimes distracted, sometimes engaged. Vanessa would respond, her tone polite, measured, always appropriate. On the surface, there was no conflict, no raised voices, no obvious fractures. And yet, there were moments that didn't quite fit. Small pauses. Glances that lingered a second too long. Richard noticed them, even if he never addressed them. After dinner, he would often sit with Liam in the living room. The boy would climb beside him, asking questions that didn't have to make sense. "Did you build houses like this?" Liam once asked, looking around. "Something like it," Richard answered, a faint smile forming. "But not as nice as this one." That answer came without hesitation, but there was something underneath it, a quiet truth he chose not to say out loud. The room would fill with soft laughter as Richard showed Liam how to fix a loose toy or told him stories about how things used to be. In those moments, the past didn't feel heavy. It felt useful, alive again through someone who was still willing to listen. Liam's laughter became a kind of anchor. A visual moment that held everything together. Because when the boy smiled wide, unguarded, it was easy to believe that this was enough. That this was what all the sacrifice had been for. But even in those moments, something else was happening just outside that small circle. Across the room, Vanessa would sometimes watch. Not openly. Not in a way that demanded attention. Just a glance. A slight tightening of her expression when Richard spoke too long. A subtle shift when Liam leaned closer to his grandfather instead of going to her. The kind of reaction that could be dismissed, easily explained away. If anyone had asked, Richard might have said everything was fine. Because nothing had broken yet. But something had already begun to change. And this time, it wasn't happening in the open. At first, it wasn't anything you could point to. No arguments, no confrontations, just a shift, subtle enough to be ignored if you weren't paying attention. Vanessa never said anything directly to Richard. She didn't need to. Her tone did the work for her. Dinner's getting crowded lately, she remarked one evening, placing plates on the table without looking at him. It sounded casual. It almost passed as a joke. Richard gave a small nod, pretending not to notice the weight behind it. I can eat later if it helps, he offered quietly. No, it's fine, she replied, too quickly. Then added, we just need more space, that's all. More space. The words lingered longer than they should have. Days passed, and those comments didn't stop, they evolved. A suggestion here, a sigh there. The kind of friction that didn't break anything immediately, but slowly wore it down. Derek, at first, stayed neutral. He didn't agree, didn't argue. He just avoided. Conversations became shorter. Eye contact faded. Where he once asked, "How was your day?" there was now silence or a distracted "yeah, okay," while scrolling through his phone. One night, Richard tried to bring something up. I was thinking maybe I could help with Liam's school project this weekend, he said, keeping his voice light. Derek didn't look up. We'll see. It wasn't a no. But it wasn't a yes either. And somehow that felt worse. Little by little, Richard adjusted himself, speaking less, staying out of the way, moving through the house as if he were visiting rather than living there. He told himself it was temporary. That families went through phases. Still, a question began to form, one he couldn't fully ignore. Am I becoming a burden? The thought didn't arrive all at once. It built quietly, shaped by small moments that didn't make sense on their own but connected too easily when placed side by side. Then came the night he heard it. He hadn't meant to listen. He was on his way to the kitchen, the house dim and quiet, when voices stopped him mid-step. Derek and Vanessa were in the living room, their tones lower than usual, but not low enough. We can't keep doing this, Vanessa said, her voice tight, controlled. Doing what? Derek replied, though there was hesitation in it. This. Him being here. It's not working. A pause followed. Long enough to matter. Richard stood still in the hallway, just out of sight, his hand resting against the wall as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He's my dad, Derek said finally, but the words lacked the conviction they once would have carried. I know, Vanessa answered, softer now, but no less firm. But this isn't sustainable. We have our own life. Our own space. You need to think about us. Us. Another silence. This one heavier. Richard didn't wait to hear more. He stepped back quietly, careful not to make a sound, retreating before the conversation could reach whatever came next. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing in particular. Nothing had been said to his face. And yet, everything had been made clear. The house hadn't changed, but his place in it, already had. After that night, the shift didn't stay hidden anymore. It moved into the open, not through loud arguments, but through decisions Richard was no longer part of. Conversations happened without him. Plans were made around him. And slowly, almost methodically, his presence became something to work around instead of something to include. It started with small things. "We're thinking of repainting the living room," Vanessa said one afternoon, flipping through color samples at the table. Richard looked up, instinctively leaning in. "Maybe something lighter would open up the space," he offered, his tone careful, respectful. Vanessa didn't even glance at him. "We've already decided," she replied, turning a page. A beat passed. Derek sat across from her, nodding. "Yeah, we've got it covered." The sentence landed harder than it should have. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. No discussion. No acknowledgement. Just a quiet line drawn. Moments like that began to stack quickly. What used to feel like a shared home now felt segmented, divided into spaces where Richard no longer belonged. He noticed it most in the evenings. Dinner times changed. Liam already ate, Vanessa would say, even when Richard had just walked in. Or, "We didn't know when you'd be back," though his schedule hadn't changed in years. At first, he tried to adjust. He told himself it was just miscommunication. Timing. Nothing intentional. Until one night, he found himself alone at the table. A single plate. No voices. No movement in the other rooms. He sat down anyway. The sound of his fork against the plate echoed louder than expected, filling the silence in a way that made the house feel unfamiliar. Across the room, the television murmured faintly, but no one called him to join. He didn't rush. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if stretching the moment might somehow bring back what used to be there. But nothing changed. Upstairs, a door closed. Then another. And, just like that, the house separated itself from him completely. Later that night, Richard tried again, this time with Derek. "I was thinking we could all sit down this weekend," he said, standing near the doorway, not quite stepping in. "Just talk. Make sure everything's okay." Derek didn't look at him immediately. When he did, there was something different in his eyes, not anger, not even frustration. Just distance. "We're fine," he said. "There's nothing to talk about." Richard held his gaze for a second longer than usual. "It doesn't feel that way." That was when Vanessa spoke, her voice cutting in from across the room. "Because you're making it feel that way," she said, calm but firm. "You keep inserting yourself into things that aren't yours to manage." The words were sharp, but controlled, carefully chosen. Richard blinked, caught off guard. "I wasn't trying to. We need space," she continued, not raising her voice. "Our decisions. Our life." Derek didn't interrupt. Didn't soften it. Didn't defend him. And that silence said more than anything else could have. Richard nodded slowly, stepping back without another word. The conversation was over, even if it hadn't really begun. But later, as he passed the hallway again, something stopped him. Voices. Lower this time. Tighter. "You need to say it," Vanessa insisted. "I will," Derek replied, though there was hesitation in it. "When?" she pressed. "Because this can't go on." A pause. Then, quieter, "It's him or us." Richard didn't stay long enough to hear the answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time, the possibility became real, not just a fear, not just a thought, but something already moving toward him, step by step. And whatever came next wasn't going to be a conversation. The tension didn't explode all at once. It tightened, stretched to its limit, then snapped in a moment that felt both sudden and inevitable. It started with a voice raised just a little higher than before. "We can't keep doing this." Derek's words cut through the house, sharp enough to pull Richard from his room. Richard stepped into the hallway, his heartbeat already quickening, as if part of him had been expecting this. Vanessa stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, her expression set. Derek was pacing now, running a hand through his hair, frustration spilling over in restless movements. "What's going on?" Richard asked, his voice steady, though something beneath it trembled. Derek stopped. For a second, he didn't answer. He just looked at his father, really looked at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Then something shifted. This can't go on," Derek said again, louder now. "It's not working." Richard took a step closer. "Then let's fix it. We can sit down, talk." "No," Derek snapped, cutting him off. "That's the problem. We've talked enough." The words landed hard, but Richard didn't retreat. "I'm still your father," he said, quieter this time, as if grounding himself in something that shouldn't have been questioned. Derek let out a bitter laugh, short and hollow. "And I'm trying to build my own life here. You don't see that, do you?" A beat. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. He did see it. He had always seen it. That was the point. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "This house isn't big enough for all of us, Richard. Not like this." Richard turned to her. "I've tried to stay out of the way." "But you're still here," she replied, without hesitation. The room fell into a heavy silence. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Small footsteps. Liam appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching the railing, his eyes wide, sensing something was wrong but not understanding it. "Go back to your room," Vanessa said quickly, without looking up. But Liam didn't move. Down below, Derek's restraint finally broke. "I can't do this anymore," he shouted, the frustration turning into something harsher, something final. "I have my own family now. My own responsibilities." Richard's voice dropped. "And I'm not part of that?" Derek didn't hesitate this time. "No." The single word echoed louder than anything else. For a moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Derek walked past him, straight to the corner where Richard's belongings had been sitting packed, though no one had said why. He grabbed the suitcase, dragged it across the floor, and without slowing down, pushed the front door open. Rain rushed in immediately, cold and relentless. "Derek," Richard said, stepping forward. But Derek was already outside, the suitcase in his hand. He dropped it onto the wet pavement with a dull, final thud. "Take your things," he said, his voice hard, stripped of anything familiar. "You can't stay here anymore." Richard stood frozen at the doorway, the rain beginning to soak through his clothes, but he didn't seem to notice. "Is this really what you want?" he asked. One last attempt, one last reach. Derek's jaw tightened. His eyes didn't waver. "You're not my responsibility anymore." The words didn't just hurt, they erased something. Upstairs, Liam's voice broke through, small and uncertain. "Dad, what are you doing?" Derek didn't answer him. Richard looked up, meeting the boy's eyes for a brief second. There was confusion there. Fear. A silent question that no one was answering. Richard tried to smile, but it didn't quite form. "It's okay," he said softly, though nothing about this was okay. Vanessa stepped forward, placing a hand on Derek's arm, not to stop him, but to steady the moment. "Close the door," she said. And Derek did. Not violently. Not in anger. Just a firm push. The sound of it shutting carried a weight that settled into Richard's chest and stayed there. He stood for a few seconds longer, staring at the wood in front of him, as if waiting for it to open again. It didn't. Rain fell harder now, blurring the edges of everything. Slowly, he reached for the suitcase handle. His grip tightened, not in anger, not even in resistance, but in something quieter, something heavier. As he stepped away from the house, one thought pressed through the noise, clear and impossible to ignore. How does something that took a lifetime to build disappear in a single night? He didn't turn back. And with each step into the rain, the distance between him and that house grew, not just in space, but in something far more permanent. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be a return. The rain didn't stop when he walked away. It followed him, steady and relentless, soaking through every layer until the cold settled deep into his bones. Richard didn't have a destination in mind. He just kept moving, one step after another, as if stopping too soon would force him to face what had just happened. Streetlights blurred in the distance. Cars passed, their headlights cutting through the dark, then disappearing just as quickly. No one slowed down. No one noticed. After a while, his pace slowed on its own. The weight of the suitcase grew heavier with each step, until finally, he set it down beside a park bench. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing unevenly, his shoulders rising and falling under the soaked fabric of his coat. Then he sat. The wood was cold, damp, unforgiving. It didn't adjust to him the way a chair at home once did. It didn't welcome him. It simply existed beneath him, indifferent. Richard leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. They trembled, not violently, but enough to notice. Enough to remind him that this was real. He looked down at them, almost confused. "When did that start?" he murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible. A small gust of wind cut through the park, carrying the smell of wet grass and empty space. He pulled his coat tighter, though it made little difference. The damp had already settled in. Time passed without structure. Minutes felt stretched, undefined. Somewhere nearby, water dripped rhythmically from a metal railing, each drop echoing louder than it should have in the quiet. Richard glanced up once, instinctively, as if expecting to see someone calling him back. No one was there. The city continued around him, distant, disconnected. Laughter from far away. A door closing somewhere. Life moving forward without pause. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air. For the first time since the door had shut behind him, the question surfaced fully, clear, unavoidable, heavier than anything he had carried so far. What do I have left? The answer didn't come. He shifted slightly on the bench, adjusting his grip on the suitcase handle beside him, as if holding on to it meant holding on to something solid, something that still belonged to him. But even that felt uncertain. The night grew quieter. And in that silence, with nothing but the cold pressing in and the weight of everything he had lost settling around him, Richard didn't try to move again. Because for that moment, there was nowhere left to go. The night stretched on, heavy and unmoving, until the quiet was broken by the faint crunch of footsteps on wet gravel. At first, Richard didn't react. People passed by all the time. None of them stopped. None of them saw him. But this time, the steps slowed, then stopped. Richard. The voice was uncertain, like it didn't quite believe what it was seeing. Richard lifted his head slowly, blinking through the dim light. For a second, he didn't recognize the figure standing a few feet away, half-shadowed under a flickering lamp. Then it clicked. Samuel. His voice came out rough, like it hadn't been used in hours. Samuel Brooks stepped closer, his expression shifting from confusion to something heavier concern, maybe even disbelief. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, scanning the scene, the soaked coat, the suitcase, the stillness that didn't belong. Richard tried to straighten slightly, as if posture could explain things. "Just getting some air," he said, the excuse thin, almost transparent. Samuel didn't respond right away. He looked at him for a moment longer, then let out a quiet breath. "At this hour? In this weather?" A pause followed. Richard's grip tightened on the suitcase handle. "It's temporary," he added, though even he didn't seem convinced. Samuel lowered himself onto the other end of the bench, the wood creaking faintly under the added weight. "You always said that," he murmured, almost to himself. "Back when we worked together." "It's temporary." Richard let out a small, tired exhale. "Most things are." "Not everything," Samuel replied, turning slightly toward him. "Some things stay longer than they should." The words hung there, not accusatory, just accurate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of distant traffic filled the gap, steady and indifferent. Then Samuel leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "What happened?" Richard didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted down, watching a drop of water slide off the edge of his sleeve and disappear into the ground. He could have said a lot, explained everything. Instead, he settled on something simpler. "He asked me to leave." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Your son?" A slight nod. Another pause. Samuel let out a breath through his nose, slower this time. "And you just walked out?" Richard's lips pressed together briefly. "What was I supposed to do? Stay where I'm not wanted?" Samuel didn't argue with that. Instead, he studied him more closely, as if trying to piece together something beneath the surface. "You gave him everything, didn't you?" he said quietly. Richard didn't respond, but the silence was enough. Samuel shook his head slightly, a mix of disbelief and frustration crossing his face. "All those years, all that work." He hesitated, then asked the question that landed differently from the rest. "You gave it all away, but what did you keep for yourself?" Richard looked up at that. Not defensively. Not even confused. Just caught off guard. Because the answer didn't come easily. His mind searched for something, anything, but found nothing solid enough to hold on to. Samuel leaned back slightly, watching that realization settle in. "I'm not saying this to make it worse," he added, his tone softer now. "I'm saying it because maybe you're not as empty as you think." Richard let out a quiet breath, the first one that felt different from the rest. "Doesn't feel that way," he admitted. Samuel gave a small nod. "It wouldn't. Not tonight." Another pause. Then, more quietly, "But nights like this don't usually tell the whole story." Richard's gaze drifted forward again, toward the dark path stretching beyond the bench. For the first time since he sat down, something shifted, not a solution, not even hope exactly, but a slight change in direction. A question without an answer, yet. And somewhere beneath the weight of everything he had lost, a thought began to form, faint, uncertain, but present. Maybe this wasn't the end of what he had. Maybe he hadn't lost everything after all. The conversation with Samuel didn't end with answers. It left something open, something unresolved that followed Richard long after the words faded. The rain had softened to a drizzle by then, but the weight inside him hadn't lifted. If anything, it had shifted, turning into something quieter, more persistent. Samuel stood up first, brushing the damp from his coat. "You can't stay out here," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. "Come on. At least get somewhere warm." Richard hesitated, his hand still resting on the suitcase handle. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse, like pride or exhaustion would keep him rooted in place. But then he nodded slowly, as if the decision cost more than it should have. They walked in silence for a while. Streetlights passed overhead, each one casting a brief pool of light before fading behind them. The rhythm of their steps filled the space where conversation might have been. Eventually, Samuel spoke again. "There's someone you should talk to." Richard glanced at him, faintly confused. "About what?" "About everything," Samuel replied. "Legal things. The house. The money." Richard's expression tightened slightly. "I'm not looking to start a fight." "I didn't say you were," Samuel answered evenly. "But you need to understand where you stand." Another step. Then another. Richard exhaled. "It's my son." Samuel stopped walking. "Exactly," he said, turning to face him. "Which is why this matters even more." The words didn't push. They settled. Richard looked away, his gaze drifting toward the empty street. He could already feel the resistance rising inside him, not anger, not denial, but something heavier. Loyalty. Habit. The kind that doesn't disappear just because it's no longer returned. "I don't want to turn this into something ugly," he said quietly. Samuel's tone softened. "Maybe it already is." That landed differently. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The air felt still again, like it had back on the bench, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was waiting. Richard's mind began to circle the same question, over and over, refusing to settle. Is it worth it to go against your own son? The thought didn't feel right. It didn't sit cleanly. Everything he had done, every sacrifice, every choice, had been built around protecting that relationship, not challenging it. But then another thought followed, quieter, harder to ignore. What if staying silent means losing everything anyway? He tightened his grip on the suitcase slightly, grounding himself in something tangible. Samuel took a step closer. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "Just hear what the lawyer has to say. That's it." Richard looked at him again, searching for pressure, for insistence, but found none. Just a steady, patient certainty. A small shift happened then. Not a full decision. Not yet. But enough. "Just a conversation," Richard repeated under his breath, as if testing the idea. Samuel gave a short nod. "That's all." Richard let the silence stretch for a moment longer. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded back. "All right," he said. The word was quiet, but it carried weight. Because it wasn't just agreement. It was the first step toward something he had spent his whole life avoiding. And neither of them said it out loud, but both understood it. Once that door opened, things wouldn't go back to the way they were. The office felt too quiet for what Richard was carrying inside him. Clean walls, neatly stacked folders, the faint hum of a printer somewhere in the background, everything about the space suggested order, clarity, control. None of which he felt. He sat across from Edward Hayes, his hands resting on the edge of the desk, fingers still slightly unsteady, though he tried to hide it. "Let's start from the beginning," Edward said calmly, sliding a folder closer. "You said you helped purchase the house?" Richard nodded. "I paid for it. Almost all of it." Edward didn't react immediately. He simply opened the folder, pulling out a series of documents. Papers shifted, edges aligned, the soft sound of pages turning filling the silence. Then he paused, eyes narrowing slightly as he read more carefully. "Do you have records of the transfer?" he asked. Richard reached into his coat, pulling out a folded envelope Samuel had insisted he bring. Inside, bank statements, transaction confirmations, copies of old paperwork. he had never thought he'd need again. Edward took them, laying each sheet flat under the desk lamp. Light hit the paper. Names, numbers, dates. One by one, they began to connect. Richard watched in silence, his gaze fixed on the documents as if they might say something before the lawyer did. A transfer amount highlighted. A signature at the bottom of a page. His signature. Edward leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, not surprised, but certain. "This is clear," he said. Richard blinked. "What is?" Edward tapped the paper lightly. "The funds used to purchase the property came from you. Not partially. Substantially. That matters." The words didn't land right away. They hovered, waiting to be understood. Richard frowned faintly. "But the house, it's in his name." Edward gave a small nod. "Yes. Legally, that's the registered ownership. But that's not the full picture." He pulled another document forward, pointing to a specific section. In situations like this, financial contribution, especially at this scale, can establish a claim. Depending on how this was structured, you may have what's called a beneficial interest. Richard's eyes moved slowly across the page, though the words blurred together. "A claim," he repeated quietly. Edward met his gaze directly. "More than that." A brief pause. "Then, clearly you have legal standing." The room seemed to shift. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But enough. Richard leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under the movement. For a moment, he didn't speak. His mind circled the same point, trying to reconcile it with everything he believed before walking into this office. "I didn't come here to take anything from him," he said, almost defensively. Edward's tone didn't change. "Understanding your position isn't the same as acting on it." Another sheet slid across the desk. More signatures. More proof. Visible. Tangible. Undeniable. Richard stared at his name written in ink, the lines steady, confident, signed at a time when none of this had felt necessary to question. Edward closed the folder slowly, then rested his hands on top of it. "I'm going to say something you may not want to hear," he said. Richard didn't look away. Edward held his gaze. "You're not the one without options here." Silence followed. Heavy, but different from before. Because this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of something Richard hadn't felt since the door closed behind him. Control. He exhaled slowly, almost as if testing the weight of it. "Even if that's true," he said, his voice lower now, more measured, "what does that actually mean?" Edward didn't hesitate. "It means," he replied, steady and precise, "you could take it all back." The words settled into the room. And this time, they didn't fade. The words didn't leave him when he stepped out of the office. They stayed quiet, persistent, echoing in a way that didn't fade with distance. "You could take it all back." It sounded simple when Edward said it. Clear. Logical. Almost obvious. But nothing about it felt simple now. Richard walked slowly along the sidewalk, the city moving around him in its usual rhythm, untouched by what had just shifted inside him. A car passed. Someone laughed in the distance. Life continued unchanged. Inside him, nothing was steady. He stopped at a crosswalk, not because he needed to, but because his thoughts had caught up with him again. His reflection flickered faintly in the glass of a nearby window, older than he remembered, more tired than he expected. "Take it back," he repeated under his breath. The phrase didn't sit easily, because taking it back didn't just mean reclaiming money. It meant drawing a line between him and his son that might never be crossed again. A memory surfaced, uninvited but vivid. Derek at 8 years old, standing in the backyard with a broken bicycle, frustration written all over his face. "I can't fix it," the boy had said, ready to give up. Richard had knelt beside him, tools in hand. "You don't walk away from something just because it's difficult," he told him. "You figure it out." They fixed it together. The image lingered for a moment, then shifted. Derek at 18, holding his acceptance letter. The pride in his voice when he said, "I couldn't have done it without you." Another shift. Derek signing the papers for the house, barely looking up as Richard handed over everything he had built. Each memory came with its own weight. Not all of them painful. Not all of them easy to let go. Richard exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face. "What am I supposed to do now?" he murmured, not expecting an answer. The question wasn't about legality anymore. It was about something harder. Do you choose fairness, or do you hold on to family, even when it no longer holds on to you? He tried to imagine both outcomes. If he walked away, said nothing, let it all go, what would remain? A fragile connection, maybe. Occasional calls. Forced visits. A version of family that existed more in memory than in reality. If he acted, if he followed through, what would that cost? Silence. Distance. Possibly the end of whatever was left between them. His jaw tightened slightly. "Is it already gone?" he asked quietly, almost challenging the thought itself. No immediate answer came. Only the memory of a door closing. The sound of it. The finality. Richard looked down at his hands again, steadier now, but not because the decision was easier, because he was beginning to understand what it required. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't revenge. It was about truth. Another step forward. Then another. The conflict didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It stopped pulling him in opposite directions and instead forced him to stand still and face it directly. Whatever he chose, something would be lost. But for the first time, he allowed himself to consider a different possibility. Maybe something had already been lost long before tonight. And maybe what he was deciding now wasn't whether to break the relationship, but whether to finally see it for what it had become. The question didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling him. By the time Richard reached the end of the block, something inside had shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to change the direction of his next step. He slowed, then stopped, standing under a dim streetlight as the last drops of rain slid from the edge of his coat. For a moment, he closed his eyes. Not to escape, but to decide. He could still go back. Knock on that door. Say the right words. Apologize for things that weren't his fault. Make himself smaller, easier to accept. The option was there, clear and familiar. But the image that followed wasn't comforting. It was him standing in that doorway again, waiting to be allowed in. Waiting to be tolerated. Waiting to be less. His eyes opened. "No," he said quietly, the words steady, grounded in something new. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His thumb hovered over Derek's name for a second. One call. That was all it would take to undo this path, to slip back into the role he had played for years. The screen dimmed slightly, waiting. Richard looked at it, then locked it. The small click felt louder than it should have. A decision. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly, as if something inside him had aligned for the first time in a long while. "I won't do that again," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The words weren't about Derek. They were about him. He turned and began walking again, this time with intention, not aimless, not drifting, but moving toward something, even if he couldn't fully see it yet. Each step felt different. Lighter, but firmer. The memory of the door closing was still there, but it no longer pulled him backward. It sat behind him now, where it belonged. A passing reflection caught his attention in a dark window. He paused briefly, looking at himself, not the man who had been left outside, but the one standing here now. There was still exhaustion. Still uncertainty. But there was something else too. Resolve. "I'm not asking for anything back," he said under his breath, testing the thought as it formed. "I'm taking responsibility for what's mine." The distinction mattered. Because this wasn't about reclaiming control over others. It was about reclaiming it over himself. A car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the pavement, illuminating his figure for just a second before fading again. In that brief flash of light, the direction ahead seemed clearer, not in detail, but in certainty. He wasn't going back. Not to plead. Not to explain. Not to justify. Another step forward. Then another. And with each one, the weight he had been carrying began to settle into something more stable, not lighter, not easier, but his. The man who had stood in the rain hours ago, waiting for the door to open, was still part of him. But he wasn't leading anymore. Because somewhere between the silence, the memories, and the truth he could no longer ignore, Richard had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He would not be a victim in his own life again. The decision didn't turn into action overnight, but once it settled, it didn't fade either. By the next morning, Richard was already sitting across from Edward again, this time with a different posture. Not defensive. Not uncertain. Just focused. The office looked the same, but the air between them had changed. Edward opened a fresh folder, glancing up briefly. "You came back," he noted. Richard gave a small nod. "I didn't come here to argue with you yesterday," he said. "I came here to understand. Now I need to know what happens next." That was enough. Edward adjusted his glasses slightly and began laying out documents across the desk, clean sheets, structured steps, each one building towards something that felt less like emotion and more like direction. "If you decide to move forward," Edward said, tapping one page lightly, "everything depends on proof. Not assumptions. Not intentions. Evidence." Richard leaned in, his eyes tracking each paper as it was placed down. Bank transfers. Property records. Signatures that once felt routine now carried weight. "I kept more than I thought," Richard murmured, almost to himself. Edward nodded. "That works in your favor." A pen slid across the table. "Start here," Edward added. Richard picked it up, holding it for a second longer than necessary. The motion was simple, just a signature, just a step, but it marked something larger. He lowered the pen, his hand steady now, and signed where he was told. One document, then another. Each page turned with a quiet, deliberate rhythm. No rush. No hesitation. Outside, the city moved as usual. Inside, something precise was taking shape. "Once this is filed," Edward continued, "the process begins. It won't be immediate, but it will be effective." Richard didn't interrupt. He listened, absorbing each detail, not emotionally this time, but practically. Timelines. Legal pathways. Outcomes. Control wasn't an idea anymore. It was structure. At one point, Edward paused, watching him carefully. "You're very calm about this." Richard leaned back slightly, considering the observation. "I've already had the worst part happen," he said. "Everything after this is just deciding what to do with it." Edward didn't respond right away, but something in his expression shifted. Respect, maybe. The final set of papers was stacked neatly in front of Richard. All of this stays confidential for now, Edward said. Nothing moves until we move it. Richard glanced down at the folder, then closed it slowly. The sound was soft, but deliberate. He stood up, slipping his coat on with a kind of quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. What happens when they find out? He asked. Edward met his gaze. They won't. Not until it's too late to stop it. A brief silence followed. Richard nodded once. Not in hesitation, but in understanding. As he turned to leave, the weight of what he had just set in motion didn't feel chaotic or overwhelming. It felt contained, directed, measured. And somewhere beneath that calm, something else began to form, not anger, not even satisfaction, but a quiet awareness of what was coming. Because this time, he wasn't reacting. He was preparing. And the plan he had just agreed to wasn't something anyone in that house would see coming. The process moved forward quietly, almost invisibly, as if nothing had changed at all. On the surface, there were no confrontations, no raised voices, no legal notices delivered to the front door. Derek went on with his life, unaware, untouched. And that was exactly how Richard intended it. He didn't file a lawsuit. He didn't demand anything. He didn't call. Instead, he chose something else. Edward placed a new set of documents on the table, different from the ones before, cleaner, more direct. If you don't want to fight, he said calmly, there are other ways to resolve this. Richard's eyes moved across the pages, slower this time, more deliberate. What kind of ways? He asked. Edward didn't hesitate. You convert your position into action. Quietly. Legally. A brief pause. Then he added, you sell. The word didn't hit immediately. It lingered, suspended between them, waiting to be understood. Richard leaned back slightly. Sell the house, he asked, not out of disbelief, but to hear it said clearly. Edward gave a small nod. Your financial claim gives you leverage. With the right structure, you can initiate a sale without direct confrontation. Richard didn't respond right away. His mind moved through the implications, not emotionally this time, but strategically. No courtroom. No argument. No warning. Just outcome. And they wouldn't know? Richard asked. Edward's tone remained steady. Not until the process reaches a point where it can't be reversed. Silence followed. But it wasn't hesitation. It was alignment. Richard looked down at the documents again. Purchase agreements. Authorization forms. Legal clauses that translated years of quiet sacrifice into something structured, actionable. He reached for the pen. For a second, his hand hovered above the page, not because he doubted the decision, but because he understood exactly what it meant. Then he signed. Ink met paper. His name, written clearly, firmly, this time not giving something away, but setting something in motion. Another page slid forward. Another signature. Each motion precise, controlled, without urgency. Across from him, Edward watched, saying nothing. There was no need to explain further. The direction had already been chosen. Once this is finalized, Edward said after a moment, the property enters the market under legal authority. The buyer won't be connected to you directly. Richard nodded slightly, absorbing it. Anonymous. Clean. Irreversible. A faint reflection of the room appeared in the polished surface of the desk, papers aligned, signatures complete, a transaction that hadn't happened yet, but already felt decided. Do it, Richard said quietly. Edward gathered the documents, stacking them with care. It's already in motion. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. Inside that house, Derek would walk through the same rooms, sit in the same spaces, completely unaware that every wall, every corner, every sense of ownership was already shifting beneath him. No arguments. No warnings. No second chances. Richard stood up slowly, adjusting his coat. There was no visible emotion on his face, no anger, no satisfaction, only a calm that came from knowing the next move had already been made. Because this time, he didn't react. He acted. And the outcome he had just set in motion wasn't something anyone in that house could stop. Back at the house, nothing seemed out of place. The lights turned on at the usual time, the front door opened and closed with the same familiar rhythm, and inside, life continued as if the past few days had already been forgotten. Derek moved through the living room with quiet confidence, dropping his keys on the table, loosening his tie as if returning to something that still belonged entirely to him. "Did you call the contractor?" Vanessa asked from the kitchen, her voice steady, casual. "Yeah," Derek replied, reaching for a glass. "We're still on schedule." No hesitation. No second thought. The conversation flowed easily, like it always had when nothing challenged it. Plans were discussed. Small complaints about work. A passing comment about Liam's school. Everything fit neatly into place, each moment reinforcing the same assumption that the house, the life, the stability were secure. Upstairs, Liam's footsteps echoed briefly before fading into the background. A door closed. The television flickered on, casting soft light across the room. Vanessa glanced around once, her eyes lingering for just a second on the empty chair that used to be occupied. "It's quieter now," she said, almost as an observation. Derek shrugged. It was time. The words came easily. Too easily. And that was the point. Because nothing in their tone suggested doubt. Nothing hinted at consequence. They had already adjusted, already moved forward, already rewritten the situation into something that made sense for them. Outside, the house stood exactly the same, walls solid, windows still, everything appearing untouched. But beneath that surface, something had already begun to shift. Paperwork processed. Signatures completed. Decisions set into motion without a single ripple reaching them yet. Derek leaned back on the couch, completely unaware, the weight of ownership still resting comfortably on his shoulders. And for now, it felt real. It felt permanent. But it wasn't. Because the truth hadn't arrived yet. And when it did, it wouldn't knock first. They were still living inside a moment that had already passed. Still believing in something that was already slipping away. And the most dangerous part? They had no idea what was coming next. The first sign didn't come with noise. It arrived quietly, almost respectfully, as if it didn't want to disturb the illusion they had built around themselves. A knock at the door, short, controlled, just as Derek was leaving for work. "I'll get it," Vanessa called out, wiping her hands as she moved from the kitchen. When she opened the door, no one was standing there. Just a sealed envelope resting neatly on the doorstep. For a second, she hesitated. Then she picked it up. The paper felt heavier than it should have. "Probably just paperwork," she muttered, closing the door behind her, already turning back toward the kitchen. But something about the envelope slowed her down. No logo. No casual markings. Just a printed name. Derek Coleman. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge. "Derek," she called out, her tone shifting just enough to catch his attention. He stepped back into the hallway, adjusting his watch. "What is it?" Vanessa didn't answer immediately. She held the envelope up, studying it again, as if expecting it to explain itself before she opened it. "Looks official," she said quietly. Derek frowned, stepping closer. From who? She shook her head once, then slid her finger under the seal. The sound of paper tearing echoed more sharply than it should have. A micro moment. The envelope opened. Inside, a stack of documents, crisp, structured, unmistakably formal. Vanessa pulled them out, her eyes scanning the first page. At first, there was no reaction. Just reading. Processing. Then her expression changed. "Derek," she said, more urgently this time. He took the papers from her, his eyes moving quickly across the text. Lines of legal language, terms that didn't belong in their everyday life, phrases that felt out of place in the comfort of their home. Notice, transfer, authorization. He read aloud, the words breaking unevenly. A pause. Then, what is this? Vanessa didn't respond. She was already flipping through the next pages, faster now, her breathing shifting slightly, the calm she had held on to starting to fracture. "This doesn't make sense," she said, shaking her head. "This has to be a mistake." But Derek wasn't nodding anymore. He had stopped at a specific line, his eyes fixed, reading it again. And again. "No," he murmured, almost under his breath. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had moved in without warning. Vanessa stepped closer. "What does it say?" Derek didn't answer right away. His grip on the paper tightened, just slightly, enough to crease the edge. "It says," he started, then stopped. Another micro pause. Then, slower, "it says the property is being processed for sale." The words landed. Hard. Vanessa stared at him. "That's not possible." But the paper didn't change. The ink didn't fade. The language remained cold, precise, and very real. Derek looked up, his expression no longer confident, no longer certain. For the first time, something unfamiliar appeared, doubt. "How could this even happen?" Vanessa asked, her voice rising now, the control slipping. Derek didn't have an answer. Because the question itself was already too late. The process had begun. The signatures were real. And whatever they had assumed was theirs was already moving beyond their reach. Neither of them said it out loud. But both felt it. Something was coming. And this time, it wasn't something they could ignore. The silence after the words settled didn't last long. It shattered. Derek's hand tightened around the papers, the edges crumpling under pressure as his breathing grew uneven. "This is a mistake," he said at first, but the conviction was already slipping. He flipped through the pages again, faster now, searching for something, anything, that would undo what he had just read. There was nothing. Same terms. Same signatures. Same outcome. No, this doesn't make any sense," Vanessa muttered, pacing now, her voice rising with every step. He can't, but Derek had already reached for his phone. The motion was sharp. Immediate. A number dialed without hesitation. The call rang once. Twice. Then, "Hello." Richard's voice came through, calm, steady, almost distant. That was enough to ignite everything. "What did you do?" Derek's voice exploded, breaking through the room with raw force. "What the hell did you do?" A brief pause on the other end. Not confusion. Not panic. Just silence. "I received some documents," Richard replied, measured, controlled. "So did you, I assume." Derek let out a harsh breath, pacing faster now. "Don't do that. Don't talk like this is normal. They're saying the house is being sold." "Sold, Dad." "What is this?" Another pause. "Then it means exactly what it says." The simplicity of the answer made it worse. Derek stopped moving. "You're joking." "I'm not." The room tightened. Vanessa stood still now, watching, waiting, her expression shifting between disbelief and something closer to fear. "You can't do that," Derek said, his voice lower now, but no less intense. "That's my house." Richard didn't respond immediately. When he did, his tone didn't rise. It didn't sharpen. It stayed exactly the same. "It was paid for with my money." The words landed clean, direct, unavoidable. Derek shook his head, as if physically rejecting the statement. "That doesn't matter. It's in my name. You signed it over." "I signed documents," Richard replied. "I didn't give up the truth behind them." A micro-silence. Heavy. Derek ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling over. "So what, this is revenge? That's what this is? Because we asked you to leave." "No," Richard said. Firm. Clear. "This is not revenge." Another beat. Then, slower, "This is me correcting something I should have addressed a long time ago." Derek let out a disbelieving laugh, sharp and hollow. "You're destroying everything over this." "Everything," Richard repeated quietly. "Is that what you think is happening?" Derek didn't answer, because the question had already shifted something. Richard continued, still calm, still controlled. "You told me I wasn't your responsibility anymore." A pause. "I listened." The line went quiet. For a second, Derek didn't speak. The anger was still there, but something else had begun to surface underneath it, something less stable. "You could have talked to me," he said finally, but the force behind his words had weakened. "I tried," Richard replied. No accusation, just fact. "And now?" Derek pressed, gripping the phone tighter. "What do you expect me to do?" Another silence. Longer this time. "Then, that's not my decision to make for you." The answer didn't escalate. It ended something. Derek stood still, the phone still pressed to his ear, but the energy in the room had changed. The shouting had burned out, leaving something colder behind. Across the line, Richard didn't say anything more. He didn't need to, because for the first time, the balance had shifted completely. Not through force, not through anger, but through control. And Derek could feel it. Every word, every pause, every choice that had already been made without him. The call didn't end immediately, but whatever it had been before was already over. The silence on the line didn't break, it settled, heavier now, shaped by everything that had already been said. Derek was still there, still listening, but the urgency in his voice had faded into something less certain, less controlled. "Dad, just stop this," he said finally, the anger no longer sharp, but strained. "We can fix it. Whatever this is, we can fix it." Richard didn't answer right away. Across the distance, you could almost hear him breathe, steady, measured, untouched by the panic on the other side. When he spoke, his voice didn't rise. It didn't push. It didn't carry any trace of the storm Derek was caught in. "There's nothing to fix," he said quietly. That landed harder than any argument. Derek shook his head, though no one could see it. "You're going too far." A pause. Then Richard replied, just as calm, just as precise. "No. I'm going exactly as far as I should have from the beginning." The words didn't come with anger. They came with clarity. Vanessa stood nearby, listening, her arms no longer crossed, her posture no longer confident. The control she once held in every situation had slipped, replaced by something unfamiliar, uncertainty. "You're doing this to us," she said suddenly, stepping closer to the phone. "After everything, you're tearing this family apart." Richard didn't interrupt her. He let the sentence finish. Then, gently, "No," he said. "That already happened." A brief silence followed, sharper than anything before. Because there was no accusation in it. Just truth. Derek exhaled roughly, his grip tightening again. So what, you're just going to take everything? Just like that. Richard's answer came without hesitation. I'm not taking anything from you, he said. A beat. Then, clearly, I'm taking back what was mine. The sentence didn't echo. It settled. Final. Unshaken. For a moment, no one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the balance had shifted too far to pull it back. Richard continued, his tone still even, still controlled, as if he were explaining something that no longer needed emotion to carry weight. You told me I wasn't part of your responsibility, he said. You made that very clear. Another pause. I accepted it. Derek's voice dropped, quieter now. That's not what I meant. Richard didn't argue. He didn't correct him. He didn't need to. Intent doesn't change what was done, he replied. Each word landed clean, without force, without hesitation. Vanessa tried again, her voice less steady now. You're destroying your own family. Richard's response came softer this time, but no less certain. A family doesn't disappear because of a decision, he said. It disappears when respect does. The room on Derek's side felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves had shifted closer. Every argument they had prepared, every justification they believed in, seemed to dissolve under the weight of something they couldn't push back against. Because there was no anger to fight, no weakness to exploit, only certainty. Derek swallowed, the words coming slower now. So that's it? You're just done. Another pause. Not long, but enough. I'm done asking to be treated like I matter, Richard said. Then, quieter, I'm not done being who I am. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. No raised voice. No bitterness. No need to prove anything further. The outcome had already been decided, not in this call, not in this moment, but in every step that led here. Richard didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Because the truth had already been spoken, fully, completely, without distortion. And for the first time, it didn't come from pain. It came from control. The shift didn't take long to become visible. What had started as words on paper moved into something physical, undeniable. 2 days later, another knock came, but this time, it didn't wait quietly on the doorstep. It stayed. Persistent. Derek opened the door with irritation still lingering from the call, but it vanished the moment he saw the people standing there. A man in a dark suit, composed, holding a folder. Another behind him, neutral, observant. Mr. Coleman, the first man asked. Derek didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the folder, then back. Yeah. What is this? We're here regarding the property transfer, the man said, calm, almost rehearsed. You've been notified. This is the next stage of the process. Behind Derek, Vanessa stepped closer. What process? She demanded, her voice already tight. The man didn't raise his tone. He simply extended a document. Vacate notice. You have 14 days. The words didn't echo. They dropped. Heavy. Vanessa grabbed the paper, scanning it, her hands beginning to shake, not dramatically, but enough to betray the shift inside her. This isn't real, she said quickly. This can't be enforced like this. It already is, the man replied. A micro-silence. Derek stepped forward, his voice rising again, but this time it lacked the certainty it once had. You can't just show up and tell us to leave. This is our house. The man held his gaze unmoved. It is no longer under your control. That was it. No argument. No escalation. Just fact. Inside, the house suddenly felt different, not as a home, but as something temporary, something already in transition. Vanessa moved back slowly, her eyes darting around the room as if seeing it for the first time without ownership. "This is insane," she whispered, more to herself now. Derek didn't respond. He stood frozen for a second, then turned sharply, walking back inside as if movement alone could push the situation back into place. It didn't. Because outside, things were already beginning to change. Later that day, the first box appeared on the front steps. Then another. Clothes. Small furniture. Personal items stacked without ceremony, without care for how they looked, just moved, relocated, removed from the space they had once filled. Vanessa stood near the doorway, watching as each piece crossed the threshold. Her arms hung at her sides now, no longer defensive, no longer controlled. "They can't do this," she said again, but the words carried less weight each time. Derek stepped outside, looking at the growing pile, his expression shifting from anger to something harder to name. Not disbelief anymore. Exposure. Neighbors passed by, slower than usual, their glances lingering just a bit longer than politeness allowed. No one spoke, but the silence said enough. This wasn't private anymore. This was visible. Every item placed outside told the same story, one they hadn't prepared for, one they couldn't contain. Vanessa turned slightly, her voice lower now, almost breaking. "Derek, fix this." But he didn't move, didn't answer. Because for the first time, there was nothing he could fix. The control they thought they had was gone. And what replaced it wasn't chaos. It was consequence. Quiet. Public. Final. And now the story stops, but the question doesn't. Because what Richard did wasn't loud. It wasn't revenge in the way people expect. He didn't scream. He didn't chase. He didn't beg to be loved again. He simply made a choice and followed it all the way through, no matter what it cost. So let me ask you something, and don't answer too quickly. If you were in his place, standing outside that door, hearing your own child tell you that you no longer mattered, what would you do? Would you go back? Would you knock again, hoping they'd change? Or would you walk away and take back everything that was yours? Some people will say forgiveness is strength. That family should come before anything, no matter how much it hurts. Others will look at Richard and say enough is enough. That respect has a line, and once it's crossed, you don't return to it like nothing happened. So where do you stand? Are you team forgive, believing that letting go is the only way to keep a family alive? Or are you team walk away, choosing dignity, even if it means losing the people you once called home? But here's the part that makes it harder. What if both choices cost you something you can't get back? And what if the real question isn't what you would do, but what kind of person you become after you make that choice?